At 72 years old, I never imagined I'd be standing barefoot on a stranger's porch at 3 in the morning, wearing nothing but my thin cotton nightgown while my own son screamed obscenities at me from his doorway. The November rain soaked through the fabric instantly, and I could barely see through my tears in the downpour. My arthritic hands clutched a single photograph, the only possession I'd managed to grab before Marcus shoved me out the door. That's when the porch light next door flickered on, and a tall man in a bathrobe stepped outside, his face etched with concern. I had no idea that my nightmare was about to transform into something I could never have predicted. My name is Dorothy Chen, and this is how one terrible night became the beginning of my liberation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Everything started falling apart 18 months before that rain-soaked night, though I didn't recognize the warning signs at the time. I'd been living independently in my small apartment in Seattle for 15 years after my husband Bernard passed away from a heart attack. I had my routine, my book club on Tuesdays, my volunteer work at the community garden on Thursdays, and my part-time job at the local library 3 days a week. The pay wasn't much, barely $900 a month, but combined with my Social Security I managed just fine. I was content, maybe even happy in my quiet life. Then Marcus called me one Sunday afternoon in May, his voice tight with stress. His wife Veronica had just been diagnosed with lupus, he explained, and the medical bills were piling up faster than they could handle. They had 2 young children, Emma who was 6 and little Tyler who was 4, and they were struggling to keep up with everything. The mortgage on their house in the suburbs was behind, Veronica couldn't work anymore, and Marcus's job as an insurance adjuster wasn't covering their expenses. He wondered if I might consider moving in with them just temporarily, to help with childcare and contribute what I could toward household expenses. What mother could refuse such a request? My son needed me, my grandchildren needed me, and I had raised Marcus to value family above everything else. I gave up my apartment, said goodbye to my book club friends, and packed my modest belongings into Marcus's SUV on a warm Saturday morning. Veronica greeted me with a wan smile when we arrived at their 4-bedroom colonial house, though I noticed she didn't get up from the couch to help carry my boxes inside. The children were watching cartoons, barely acknowledging my arrival. Marcus showed me to the guest room on the 2nd floor, a pleasant space with cream-colored walls and a window overlooking their backyard. For the first few weeks, everything seemed manageable. I helped with the children, cooking meals and doing laundry while Veronica rested. I gave Marcus my entire Social Security check each month, along with the money from my library job, which I'd managed to transfer to a branch closer to their neighborhood. It came to about $1,400 monthly, and I kept only $40 for myself to cover bus fare and basic personal items. The shift happened gradually, so slowly that I didn't notice the foundation crumbling beneath my feet. Veronica started asking me to clean not just my own space, but the entire house. Then she suggested I should be doing all the cooking since she wasn't feeling well. When I gently mentioned that I was already watching the children full-time and working at the library 3 days a week, she looked at me with cold eyes and said that family members who lived rent-free shouldn't complain about pulling their weight. Rent-free. The word stung because I was giving them nearly every penny I earned. But I held my tongue, telling myself that Veronica was sick and stressed, that she didn't mean to be cruel. Marcus worked long hours and came home exhausted, collapsing in front of the television while I bathed his children and read them bedtime stories. When I tried to talk to him about feeling overwhelmed, he'd pat my shoulder absently and say that things would get better soon, that we just needed to get through this rough patch. The real trouble started 8 months after I moved in. I came down with a terrible flu that left me weak and feverish. I asked Veronica if she could watch the children for one day while I rested, explaining that I could barely stand up. She stood in the doorway of my room, arms crossed, and told me that she had lupus and couldn't be expected to chase after 2 energetic kids. If I was too lazy to do my job, maybe I should reconsider my living arrangement. I dragged myself out of bed, shaking with fever, and took care of Emma and Tyler while Veronica watched her reality shows downstairs. That's when I began to understand that I wasn't a beloved family member in this house. I was free labor and a monthly paycheck, nothing more. The realization settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. But where could I go? I'd given up my apartment, and rent in Seattle was far beyond what I could afford on my limited income. I was trapped, and Veronica knew it. Things deteriorated further when Marcus got a promotion at work. Instead of easing the financial pressure, the extra income seemed to fuel Veronica's resentment toward me. She started buying expensive clothes and getting her nails done weekly, while I wore the same 3 outfits I'd been rotating for months. She redecorated the living room with furniture that cost more than I used to make in half a year. And she began talking about how they needed more space, how the house felt crowded with an extra person living there. One evening in September, Marcus called me into the living room where he and Veronica sat side by side on their new leather sofa. They'd been discussing my situation, he explained in that careful voice people use when they're about to deliver bad news. They appreciated everything I'd contributed, but they needed to make some changes. The guest room I'd been using was going to become Veronica's craft room. However, they'd come up with a solution. They had a finished basement with a small bathroom, and I could move down there. It would give me more privacy, Marcus said, as if he were doing me a favor. The basement was damp and cold, with tiny windows near the ceiling that barely let in any natural light. The bathroom was moldy and the shower leaked, leaving puddles on the concrete floor. There was no bedroom furniture, just an old futon mattress that Marcus dragged down the stairs, its springs poking through the thin fabric. But what choice did I have? I moved my belongings downstairs, hanging my few clothes on a tension rod in the corner and stacking my books on the floor because there were no shelves. I cried myself to sleep that first night in the basement, my bones aching from the dampness and cold. The arthritis in my hands and knees, which had been manageable before, flared up painfully. I couldn't afford the medication anymore because I was giving away all my money, and I was too proud to ask Marcus for help. Each morning I'd wake up stiff and hurting, forcing myself up the basement stairs to get the children ready for school, and start the endless cycle of cooking and cleaning. Veronica's treatment of me grew increasingly hostile. She started leaving me lists of chores each morning, tasks that seemed designed more to humiliate than to help. Scrub the grout in the upstairs bathroom with a toothbrush. Reorganize the garage. Iron Marcus's work shirts even though they were all permanent press. When I didn't complete everything on her list, she'd berate me loudly enough for the children to hear, telling me I was lazy and ungrateful for everything they'd done for me. The children began treating me differently too, influenced by their mother's behavior. Emma started talking back to me, refusing to do her homework when I asked. Tyler would throw his toys at me when I tried to clean his room. When I attempted to discipline them gently, Veronica would intervene and tell me I had no right to parent her children. My role was to serve them, nothing more. I started losing weight because I was eating less. Veronica had made it clear that I should eat after everyone else, and often there wasn't much left. She'd make elaborate meals for the family, and leave me a small portion that was usually cold by the time I could sit down. Sometimes there was nothing at all, and I'd make myself a peanut butter sandwich with the heels of the bread loaf that no one else wanted. My clothes hung loose on my shrinking frame, and I developed a persistent cough from the mold in the basement bathroom. The library became my sanctuary. Those 12 hours a week when I could escape the house and be treated like a human being. My coworkers were kind, asking after my health and noticing when I seemed tired or unwell. Mrs. Pacheco, the head librarian, pulled me aside one afternoon and asked if everything was all right at home. I forced a smile and assured her everything was fine, that I was just adjusting to living with my son's family. I couldn't bear to tell her the truth, couldn't admit that my own child had reduced me to something less than a servant. Winter arrived early that year, and the basement became unbearably cold. There was a small space heater, but Veronica told me I could only use it for 2 hours in the evening because it drove up the electricity bill. I spent nights shivering under every piece of fabric I owned, my teeth chattering so hard I thought they might crack. The cough I developed got worse, deep and rattling, and sometimes I'd wake up gasping for air in the middle of the night. I tried to talk to Marcus about my living conditions, catching him one evening when Veronica was out getting her nails done. I explained that the basement was too cold, that I was getting sick, that I needed better accommodations or at least permission to use the heater more often. He barely looked up from his phone, scrolling through something that seemed far more important than his mother's suffering. "The basement is fine," he said dismissively. "You're just being dramatic. Plenty of people live in basements. Besides, we're already stretched thin financially. We can't afford to heat the whole house to tropical temperatures. I wanted to scream at him that I was giving them my entire income, that they weren't stretched thin, they were spending money on luxuries while I froze in their basement. But the words stuck in my throat, choked by a lifetime of trying to be a good mother, of not wanting to be a burden, of hoping that somehow my sacrifice would be appreciated or at least acknowledged. So I went back down to my cold corner and cried silently into my thin pillow. November brought freezing rain and the first hints of snow. My cough had developed into something more serious, and I could feel a heaviness in my chest that terrified me. I knew I should see a doctor, but I had no money for copays and I was afraid to ask Marcus for help. I'd become so small in that house, so invisible, that I wasn't sure anyone would notice if I simply stopped breathing one night in the basement. The catastrophic night happened on a Tuesday. I'd had an especially difficult day.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Running a fever and feeling dizzy while I tried to keep up with my usual duties. Veronica had been in a foul mood, snapping at me for every minor infraction. The chicken I'd cooked was too dry. The bathroom I'd cleaned still had water spots on the mirror. The children's homework wasn't done. To her satisfaction, even though Emma had refused to work with me and Tyler had spent the afternoon throwing tantrums. By 9 o'clock that evening I could barely stand. I asked Marcus if I might skip washing the dinner dishes just this once and do them in the morning because I felt very ill. Veronica overheard from the living room and came storming into the kitchen, her face twisted with fury. She launched into a tirade about how I was always making excuses, always trying to get out of work, always acting like I was entitled to special treatment. I tried to defend myself, my voice weak and shaking, and that's when she said something that changed everything. If you're going to live here, you need to earn your keep. You're nothing but dead weight, Dorothy. A burden on this family. We'd be better off without you. Something inside me snapped. For 18 months I'd endured their cruelty, their exploitation, their systematic destruction of my dignity. But to be told I was a burden when I'd given them everything, when I'd sacrificed my health and independence and self-respect, that was more than I could bear. My voice rose, surprising even myself with its strength. I told Veronica that I'd given them thousands of dollars, that I'd worked myself sick taking care of their home and children, that I deserved basic human decency. Veronica's response was to laugh, a cruel sound that echoed off the kitchen walls. She told me my money was barely enough to cover my share of the utilities. She said I should be grateful they hadn't kicked me out months ago when I'd stopped being useful. And then she turned to Marcus, who'd been standing frozen in the doorway, and told him it was time to make a decision. Either I apologized for my disrespectful outburst and accepted my place in the household, or I needed to leave immediately. I looked at my son, the boy I'd raised alone after his father abandoned us when he was just 3 years old. I'd worked 2 jobs to keep him clothed and fed. I'd sat up with him through every illness, helped him with every homework assignment, cheered at every soccer game and school concert. I'd sacrificed my own dreams of going back to college to make sure he could get his degree. And now he stood there, unable to meet my eyes, as his wife demanded he choose between us. Marcus, I said quietly, my heart breaking with every word. Please don't do this. I'm your mother. He looked at Veronica, then back at me, and I saw the decision in his eyes before he spoke. I think maybe you should find somewhere else to stay for a while, Mom. Just until things cool down. You can come back when you're ready to respect the rules of our house. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood there in shock, unable to process what was happening. Then Veronica started herding me toward the basement stairs, telling me to get my things and get out. Now. Tonight. I tried to protest, explaining that it was almost midnight, that I had nowhere to go, that I was sick. But Veronica was relentless, following me down to the basement and standing over me while I gathered my belongings with trembling hands. I was moving too slowly for her satisfaction. She grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and pulled me back up the stairs. I stumbled, nearly falling, and she didn't even pause to check if I was hurt. When we reached the main floor, I realized I was still in my nightgown, the thin cotton one I'd changed into after dinner. I asked if I could at least put on proper clothes, grab my winter coat, find my shoes. But Veronica was beyond reason, screaming that I'd forfeited my rights when I disrespected her in her own home. Marcus stood by the front door, holding it open, rain blowing in and soaking the hardwood floor. I looked at him one more time, hoping he'd intervene, hoping some spark of the boy I'd raised would resurface. But he just stared at the floor, his jaw clenched as Veronica shoved me toward the door. I managed to grab the photograph on the hall table, a picture of Marcus as a child, smiling up at me with gap-toothed innocence. Then I was outside, the door slamming behind me with such force that the windows rattled. The rain was icy and relentless, soaking through my nightgown in seconds. I stood on the porch in my bare feet, hugging myself against the cold, too shocked to even cry. Behind me, I could hear Veronica's muffled voice still raging. Then the porch light went out, leaving me in darkness except for the street lamps. I walked down the steps carefully, my feet already numb on the wet concrete, and stood on the sidewalk trying to decide what to do. I had no phone. It was still down in the basement, charging on the floor next to my mattress. I had no money, no identification, no keys, nothing but the photograph clutched in my frozen hands. The nearest business was a gas station 4 blocks away, but I didn't think I could walk that far in my condition. My elderly neighbor across the street had her lights off, probably already asleep. I didn't know anyone else on this suburban street well enough to knock on their door in the middle of the night. That's when the porch light next door flickered on, warm and welcoming in the darkness. I turned to see a man in his early 60s stepping outside, pulling a bathrobe tighter against the rain. He was tall with silver hair and an air of authority even in casual clothes. I recognized him vaguely from seeing him getting his mail or working in his yard, but we'd never spoken. He walked quickly across his lawn toward me, his expression shifting from concern to alarm as he took in my appearance. "Ma'am," he called out over the rain, his voice deep and commanding. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" I opened my mouth to respond, to say something reassuring or explanatory, but instead a sob escaped, raw and desperate. My legs gave out and I sank down onto the wet grass, unable to stand any longer. The photograph slipped from my numb fingers and landed in a puddle. Within seconds, the man was kneeling beside me, his strong hands supporting my shoulders. "We need to get you inside and warm," he said firmly. "Can you walk?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I could. He helped me to my feet with surprising gentleness for someone so imposing, and guided me across the lawn toward his house. Behind us, I heard Marcus's front door open and his voice calling out angrily, demanding to know what I was doing bothering the neighbors. The man beside me stiffened and turned back toward the sound. "Is this woman related to you?" His voice cut through the rain like a blade. "She's my mother," Marcus called back, sounding defensive. "This is a family matter. She needs to come back here and apologize. Your mother is standing barefoot in freezing rain wearing a nightgown," the man said, his tone dangerous now. "I suggest you go back inside before I call the police." Marcus retreated and slammed his door again, leaving his mother in a stranger's care. The man, whose name I still didn't know, helped me up his porch steps and through his front door into a warmth that felt like heaven. He disappeared for a moment and returned with an enormous terry cloth robe and thick towels. "Let's get you dry first," he said kindly, his earlier hardness replaced by gentle concern. "Then we'll figure out what's happened here." I stood shivering in his entryway, dripping rain onto his hardwood floors, and realized that my life had just fractured into a before and after. Before this moment, I'd been trapped in a nightmare of my own son's making. After this moment, everything would be different. I just had no idea yet how different it would become, or that the man whose home I'd stumbled into had the power to change not just my circumstances, but to deliver the justice I didn't even dare dream of seeking. The stranger wrapped the thick robe around my shaking shoulders and guided me to a leather armchair in his living room. The house was impeccably maintained, with dark wood furniture and shelves lined with legal books. He excused himself and returned moments later with a stack of warm blankets and a steaming mug of tea that he pressed into my trembling hands. The heat from the ceramic felt like a blessing against my frozen fingers. "I need to call an ambulance," he said gently, studying my face with obvious concern. "You're showing signs of hypothermia, and you mentioned being ill. You need medical attention." "No," I managed to say, my voice hoarse from crying and the congestion in my chest. "Please, I can't afford an ambulance. I can't afford emergency room bills. I'll be fine once I warm up." He frowned deeply at this response but didn't argue. Instead, He sat down in the chair across from me and waited patiently while I sipped the tea. The warmth spreading through my body made me acutely aware of just how cold I'd been. Not just tonight but for months. I'd been cold in that basement every single night, my body slowly shutting down from the constant exposure to damp and freezing temperatures. "My name is Richard Thornton," he said after a few moments. "I live here alone since my wife passed away 3 years ago. I want you to know that you're safe here, and I'm not going to force you to do anything you're not comfortable with. But I would very much like to understand what just happened next door." Something about his calm, authoritative manner made me feel safe for the first time in 18 months. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the simple fact that he'd treated me with more kindness in 10 minutes than my own family had shown me in over a year. But I found myself telling him everything. The words poured out of me in a rush, interrupted occasionally by coughing fits that left me breathless and dizzy. I told him about moving in with Marcus and Veronica, about giving them my entire income while being relegated to a moldy basement. I described the endless chores, the cruel comments, the way I'd been systematically stripped of my dignity and reduced to unpaid labor. I explained about being sick for weeks with no access to medical care, about the freezing temperatures I'd endured, about going hungry while they ate restaurant meals and bought luxury items. And finally, I told him about tonight, about the argument and being thrown out into the rain in my nightgown with nowhere to go. Richard listened without interrupting, but I watched his expression grow darker with each detail I shared. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When I finished speaking, he sat in silence for a long moment, seeming to struggle with some strong emotion. "Mrs. Chen," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "What you've just described isn't simply mistreatment. It's elder abuse, and it's a serious crime. The exploitation, the unsafe living conditions, the deliberate withholding of medical care, forcing you to work while you're seriously ill. All of these things violate numerous state and federal laws." I stared at him, shocked. I'd never thought of it in those terms. These were my family members, not criminals. Surely what they'd done was just thoughtlessness or stress, not actual abuse. "I understand this is difficult to accept," Richard continued, reading my expression accurately. "Family abuse is always the hardest to acknowledge, because we want to believe our loved ones have our best interests at heart." "But Dorothy, may I call you Dorothy?" I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. "Dorothy, I'm a retired judge. I spent 30 years on the bench dealing with cases of elder abuse, exploitation, and neglect. I know what it looks like, and what happened to you meets every legal definition. The fact that your son is your abuser doesn't make it less serious. In fact, it makes it worse because he had a duty of care toward you that he violated." A judge. I was sitting in the home of a retired judge, and he was telling me that my son had committed crimes against me. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and I gripped the mug of tea harder to steady myself. "What do you want to happen now?" Richard asked gently. "Do you want to press charges? Do you want to pursue this legally? Or would you prefer to simply move forward and find safe housing?" "I don't know," I whispered. "I don't want to hurt Marcus. He's my son. I just want him to understand what he did wrong and make it right." Richard's expression softened with something that looked like pity. "Dorothy, in my experience, people who are capable of treating their elderly parents this way rarely have spontaneous realizations about their behavior. They need consequences to change. But that's your decision to make, not mine. For tonight, you're going to stay here in my guest room where it's warm and safe. Tomorrow, when you're rested and thinking more clearly, we can discuss your options." He showed me to a bedroom on the second floor that was nothing short of luxurious compared to the basement I'd been living in. The bed had a thick mattress and what looked like a down comforter. There was an attached bathroom with fluffy towels and toiletries. Richard provided me with clean pajamas that had belonged to his late wife, apologizing that they might be too large but insisting they were better than my soaked nightgown. He also gave me cold medicine and cough syrup from his cabinet, along with a glass of water and instructions to take them immediately. "Get some rest," he said kindly from the doorway. "We'll talk more in the morning. If you need anything during the night, my room is just down the hall. Don't hesitate to wake me." After he left, I stood in that beautiful room and started to cry deep wrenching sobs that I'd been holding back for so long. I cried for the life I'd lost, for the son who'd betrayed me, for the 18 months of suffering I'd endured. But underneath the grief, there was something else beginning to stir, a tiny spark of anger that I'd been too beaten down to feel before. I took a long hot shower, standing under the spray until the bathroom filled with steam and my skin turned pink from the heat. It was the first proper shower I'd had in months since the basement bathroom had only a leaky handheld attachment that barely produced lukewarm water. I put on the borrowed pajamas, took the medicine Richard had given me, and climbed into that gloriously comfortable bed. Within minutes, exhaustion pulled me under into the deepest sleep I'd had in over a year. I woke to sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows and the smell of coffee drifting up from downstairs. For a moment I was disoriented, unable to remember where I was. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back, and I felt a wave of shame and embarrassment. I'd imposed on a stranger, a retired judge no less, with my family problems. He'd been kind last night, but surely he'd want me gone this morning. I found my nightgown hanging in the bathroom, washed and dried, along with a note in neat handwriting explaining that he'd taken the liberty of laundering it, but that I was welcome to continue wearing his wife's pajamas if I preferred. There was also a new toothbrush still in its package and a comb. I got dressed slowly, my body aching less than it had in months despite yesterday's ordeal. The warm bed and proper rest had done more for me than I'd realized was possible. When I made my way downstairs, I found Richard in the kitchen, reading the newspaper at a small table while eggs sizzled in a pan on the stove. He looked up when I entered and smiled, a warm expression that reached his eyes. "Good morning, Dorothy. How are you feeling?" "Better, I admit it. Thank you for everything. I'm so sorry for imposing on you like this. I'll get out of your way as soon as possible." He set down his newspaper and gave me a stern look. "You're not imposing, and you're not going anywhere until we've had breakfast and a serious conversation about your situation. Please sit down." His tone left no room for argument, so I sat. He served me a plate with scrambled eggs, toast, and fresh fruit, more food than I'd typically eaten in an entire day at Marcus's house. We ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before he spoke again. "I did some research this morning," he said, pulling out a legal pad covered in notes. "I've been making calls to some of my former colleagues and looking into your options. First and foremost, you need to see a doctor today. That cough is concerning, and you've been living in conditions that could have caused serious health problems." "I can't afford," I started to say, but he held up his hand. "I have excellent health insurance that covers emergency guests, and I'm prepared to cover any costs that aren't covered. Your health is not negotiable, Dorothy. We're going to urgent care after breakfast, and that's final." The authority in his voice reminded me that he'd spent decades as a judge, accustomed to being obeyed. But unlike the authority figures in my recent life, his commands came from a place of genuine concern rather than a desire to control or exploit. "Second," he continued, consulting his notes, "we need to address your immediate housing situation. You obviously cannot return to your son's house. I've already made it clear to you that you're welcome to stay here as long as you need to, but I want you to understand that I'm making this offer freely without any expectation of repayment or service." I felt tears prickling my eyes again. "Why are you being so kind to me? You don't even know me." Richard was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "My mother suffered elder abuse at the hands of my younger brother and his wife during the last years of her life. I didn't discover what was happening until it was too late. She died without ever telling me how badly they'd treated her because she was protecting him, trying to preserve the family. I've lived with that guilt for 15 years, wishing I'd paid closer attention, wishing I'd intervened sooner." His voice had grown thick with emotion, and I could see the pain in his eyes. "When I saw you last night standing in the rain, I saw my mother. I saw a chance to do what I failed to do for her. So please don't thank me. Helping you is the very least I can do." We sat in silence for a moment, two people bound by the common thread of family betrayal and loss. Then Richard cleared his throat and returned to his notes, back in judge mode. "Third, we need to address the legal aspects of your situation. You've been financially exploited to the tune of roughly $25,000 over 18 months, assuming you gave them $1,400 per month. That money was taken under false pretenses and used for their benefit while you were kept in unsafe conditions. You have grounds for a civil suit to recover those funds. $25,000. I'd never thought about the total amount, had never added it up. Hearing it stated so plainly took my breath away. That was money I could have used to maintain my own apartment, to live independently with dignity. Additionally, Richard continued, the conditions you were kept in constitute criminal neglect and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Washington State takes these charges very seriously. If you choose to pursue criminal charges, I can help you navigate that process. However, I want to be clear about something important. He looked directly into my eyes, his expression grave. Filing charges against your son will permanently damage your relationship with him. There's no going back from that. You need to think very carefully about whether you're prepared for that consequence. I'll support whatever decision you make, but you need to make it with your eyes open. I stared down at my plate, the egg suddenly tasteless in my mouth. Could I really do that to Marcus? Could I have my own son arrested? The thought made me feel sick. But then I remembered standing in the freezing rain, remembered months of hunger and cold and cruelty, remembered the way he'd stood by and watched his wife throw me out like garbage. What kind of relationship was I trying to preserve? I don't know what I want, I said honestly. Everything is so confusing right now. Part of me still hopes Marcus will realize what he's done and apologize. Part of me wants him to face consequences. And part of me just wants to forget any of this ever happened. All of those feelings are valid, Richard said gently. You don't have to make any decisions today. For now, let's focus on getting you healthy and safe. Everything else can wait. True to his word, Richard drove me to an urgent care clinic after breakfast. The doctor who examined me was alarmed by what he found. Severe bronchitis bordering on pneumonia, malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, and symptoms consistent with prolonged exposure to mold and cold. He prescribed antibiotics, an inhaler, and vitamin supplements, shaking his head in disbelief when I explained my living situation. Before we left, the doctor pulled Richard aside, and I saw him nodding seriously at whatever was being said. On the drive back to Richard's house, he told me what the doctor had said privately. The physician was concerned enough about my condition to file a mandatory report with Adult Protective Services. As a medical professional, he was legally required to report suspected elder abuse. Within a few days, someone from APS would contact me to investigate my situation. I felt panic rising in my chest. I don't want this to become a big thing. I don't want government agencies involved. What if Marcus finds out? What if he gets in trouble? Richard pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned to face me. Dorothy, listen to me carefully. Marcus threw you out in a rainstorm with no shoes, no coat, no phone, and no money while you were seriously ill. He kept you in conditions that nearly killed you. He stole over $20,000 from you. He has already gotten himself in trouble. The question is whether he's going to face any consequences for his actions. But he's my son, I whispered, the words sounding weak even to my own ears. And you're his mother, Richard replied firmly. That relationship comes with responsibilities on both sides. He failed his responsibilities spectacularly. You don't owe him your silence or your protection, especially not at the cost of your own well-being and safety. We drove the rest of the way in silence, me staring out the window at the gray November sky, trying to reconcile my lifelong instinct to protect my child with the growing realization that my child had become my abuser. It was a cognitive dissonance that made my head ache worse than the bronchitis. Back at Richard's house, he settled me on the couch with blankets and turned on the television to a classic movie channel. He made me tea and brought me the medications from the pharmacy, watching to make sure I took them at the proper times. Then he excused himself to his study, explaining that he had some calls to make. I dozed on and off throughout the afternoon, waking occasionally to find Richard checking on me or bringing me soup or water. That evening, as we ate dinner together at his kitchen table, Richard brought up the subject I'd been dreading. I received a call from Adult Protective Services this afternoon. They want to meet with you tomorrow to discuss your case. I told them you were staying with me temporarily and that you were under medical care. They'll be sending a caseworker named Jennifer Holbrook. My hands trembled as I set down my fork. What will they want to know? Everything you told me last night, Richard said. They'll document your story, probably take photographs of any physical evidence like bruises or injuries, and they'll want to see medical records from today's visit. Jennifer is very experienced and compassionate. I've worked with her on several cases when I was on the bench. You can trust her. What happens after they investigate? That depends on what you want to happen, Richard said carefully. They can help you find permanent housing and connect you with resources like food assistance and healthcare. They can also pursue charges against Marcus and Veronica if you choose to cooperate with prosecution. But Dorothy, I need to tell you something else. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. I made one phone call today that I need to tell you about. I called the prosecutor's office and spoke with an old friend of mine who heads the elder abuse unit. I explained your situation in general terms without identifying you. He confirmed what I already knew, that what happened to you is prosecutable under multiple statutes. More importantly, he told me they've been building a case against Veronica for similar behavior. I stared at him in shock. What do you mean? Richard pulled out some printed documents and slid them across the table to me. After talking to the prosecutor, I did some digging in public records. Veronica Chen, your daughter-in-law, has a history. She was sued by her own grandmother 5 years ago for financial exploitation. The case was settled out of court, but the allegations were serious. Before that, she was involved in a case where an elderly aunt accused her of taking advantage of her during a period of illness. That case was dropped when the aunt died. The papers blurred in front of my eyes as I tried to process this information. Veronica had done this before? She targeted other elderly family members? I think your son was a victim of her manipulation as well, Richard said gently. Not that it excuses his behavior toward you, but I suspect Veronica has been the driving force behind your mistreatment. She has a pattern of identifying vulnerable elderly relatives and exploiting them financially and emotionally. Marcus may have been too weak or too blind to stop her, but she was the architect of this abuse. I felt something crack open inside me, a dam of emotions I'd been holding back. Rage flooded through me, hot and cleansing. Not just at Veronica, but at Marcus for being weak, at myself for allowing it to happen, at the entire situation that had stolen 18 months of my life and nearly killed me. I want her to pay, I heard myself say, my voice stronger than it had been in months. I want her to face consequences for what she did to me, and to her grandmother and her aunt. She can't keep getting away with this. Richard nodded slowly, a grim satisfaction in his expression. Then tomorrow when you meet with Jennifer Holbrook, I want you to tell her everything. Every detail, no matter how small or embarrassing. And I want you to give her permission to share your information with the prosecutor's office. Will you do that? Yes, I said without hesitation. The scared, beaten-down woman who'd stumbled onto Richard's porch last night was gone. In her place was someone who'd remembered that she had value, that she deserved justice, that staying silent to protect people who'd hurt her was not love. It was self-destruction. We spent the rest of the evening planning for the next day's meeting. Richard helped me write down everything I could remember in chronological order, all the incidents of abuse and exploitation. The list was shockingly long when I saw it written out page after page of cruelty and neglect. He took photographs of the bruises on my arm where Veronica had grabbed me, the rash on my legs from the moldy basement, my too thin frame in the borrowed pajamas. That night, I lay in the comfortable guest bed and thought about my son. I wondered if he was worried about me, if he'd tried to find out where I'd gone. Part of me hoped he was racked with guilt and fear. Part of me hoped he'd come to his senses and show up at Richard's door to apologize and beg me to forgive him. But a growing part of me knew that wasn't going to happen, that Marcus had made his choice when he opened that door and let his wife throw me out into the storm. Jennifer Holbrook arrived at 10 the next morning. A woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that immediately put me at ease. She set up a recording device on Richard's kitchen table and explained that she needed to document everything for the official investigation. Over the next 3 hours, I told my story again, this time with Richard sitting beside me for support and occasionally adding details I'd forgotten or been too embarrassed to mention. Jennifer's expression grew increasingly serious as I talked. She took extensive notes and asked pointed questions about specific incidents, particularly about the financial exploitation and the conditions in the basement. When I finished, she sat back and looked at me with a mixture of compassion and professional anger. Mrs. Chen, I want to thank you for your courage in coming forward. What you've described is one of the most clear-cut cases of elder abuse I've encountered. I'm going to be recommending immediate protective measures, and will be forwarding this case to both law enforcement and the prosecutor's office. What does that mean for Marcus? I asked, my voice small. Jennifer's expression softened. It means your son and daughter-in-law will be investigated for multiple crimes including financial exploitation, criminal neglect, and endangerment of a vulnerable adult. If the prosecutor decides to move forward, they'll likely face both criminal charges and civil liability. I know this is difficult, but you need to understand that you're not the one putting them in this position. They did this to themselves through their actions. She spent another hour explaining the process, the timeline, what I could expect. She also provided me with information about resources available to me, including emergency housing assistance, food stamps, and medical coverage for low-income seniors. Richard listened carefully to everything, occasionally asking clarifying questions with the precision of someone who'd spent decades in the legal system. After Jennifer left, I felt emotionally drained but strangely lighter. I told the truth to someone with the power to do something about it. I'd stopped protecting people who didn't deserve my protection. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had some agency over my own life. Richard made us lunch and we ate quietly, both lost in our own thoughts. Then he brought up something that had clearly been on his mind. "Dorothy, I want you to consider staying here permanently, not just until you find other housing. This house is too big for one person, and I'd appreciate the company. You'd have your own space, complete independence, and I'd never expect you to work or contribute financially unless you wanted to. I'm simply offering you a home." I looked at this man who'd been a stranger 48 hours ago, and who'd shown me more kindness than my own family. I thought about his offer, about having a real home again, about being treated with dignity and respect. Then I thought about what the alternative would be. Some subsidized apartment in a rough neighborhood, scraping by on minimal resources, forever alone and afraid. "I'd like that very much," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Richard, for everything." He smiled, genuine warmth lighting up his distinguished features. "Then it's settled. Welcome home, Dorothy." 2 days later, Richard drove me to Marcus's house to collect my belongings. We'd called ahead to make sure someone would be home, and I'd asked Jennifer Holbrook to accompany us as a witness. When Marcus opened the door, his face went pale at the sight of the three of us standing on his porch, official and united. "I'm here to collect my things," I said, keeping my voice steady. "All of my belongings from the basement and anything else that belongs to me." Marcus's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Behind him, I could hear Veronica's voice demanding to know who was at the door. When she appeared and saw us, her expression hardened into something ugly and defensive. "You can't just barge in here," she said sharply. "This is our private property. Mrs. Chen has every right to retrieve her personal belongings," Jennifer said calmly, holding up her identification. "I'm Jennifer Holbrook from Adult Protective Services, and I'm here to ensure this process goes smoothly. I suggest you cooperate fully." We spent an hour gathering my possessions, which fit easily into 3 boxes. 18 months of my life reduced to so little. Richard carried the boxes to his car, while Jennifer documented everything with photographs and notes. Marcus followed me around like a ghost, trying to speak to me several times but never quite finding the words. Veronica stayed in the living room, her arms crossed, radiating hostility. As we were leaving, Marcus finally found his voice. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. Can't we talk about this?" I turned to look at my son, really look at him, maybe for the first time in years. I saw weakness there, and selfishness, and a willful blindness that had allowed him to participate in my abuse. I saw someone who was sorry he'd been caught, not sorry for what he'd done. "There's nothing left to talk about, Marcus. You made your choices and now you'll live with the consequences. Goodbye." Walking away from that house, from my son, should have felt devastating. Instead, it felt like breaking free from chains I hadn't even realized were holding me down. Richard helped me carry my boxes into his house, up to what was now my room, and I began the process of rebuilding my life from the ruins Marcus and Veronica had made of it. 3 months passed before the legal proceedings began in earnest. During that time, I focused on healing both physically and emotionally. The antibiotics cleared up my bronchitis, and regular meals with proper nutrition helped me gain back the weight I'd lost. Richard's home became my sanctuary, a place where I could rediscover who I was beyond the broken woman I'd become in Marcus's basement. Richard and I developed an easy friendship built on mutual respect and shared morning coffee. He never treated me like a charity case or expected me to earn my keep through housework. When I offered to help with cooking or cleaning, he accepted graciously but made it clear it was appreciated, not required. We played chess in the evenings, watched old movies together, and talked about everything from politics to literature to our shared experiences with family betrayal. The prosecutor's office moved forward with charges against both Marcus and Veronica. The case was strengthened significantly when Veronica's grandmother came forward, willing to testify about her own experiences. She was an 87-year-old woman named Patricia Monroe, who'd been too ashamed to pursue her civil case to completion 5 years earlier. But hearing about what happened to me gave her courage to speak up again. I met Patricia at the prosecutor's office during one of my preparation sessions. She was a tiny woman with fierce eyes and a grip like iron when she shook my hand. "They almost destroyed me," she said without preamble. Veronica and that smooth-talking boyfriend she had back then. They convinced me to sign over power of attorney, then drained my savings account and took out credit cards in my name. By the time I realized what was happening, they'd stolen nearly $60,000. I felt sick hearing her story, recognizing the same manipulation tactics Veronica had used on me. Patricia explained that she'd been too embarrassed to tell anyone the full extent of what happened, too afraid of being judged as a foolish old woman. She'd settled the civil case quietly just to make it go away, but the money was never recovered and Veronica faced no real consequences. "This time will be different," the prosecutor assured us both. Assistant District Attorney Michael Chen, ironically sharing my last name though we weren't related, was a sharp young man in his 30s who specialized in elder abuse cases. With 2 victims willing to testify and documented evidence of a pattern of behavior, he felt confident about securing convictions. The preliminary hearing happened on a cold February morning. Richard accompanied me to the courthouse, his presence steady and reassuring. I hadn't seen Marcus or Veronica since that day I'd collected my belongings, and walking into the courtroom and seeing them seated with their defense attorney made my heart race with anxiety. Marcus looked terrible, gaunt and pale with dark circles under his eyes. He kept trying to catch my eye, but I refused to look at him directly. Veronica sat rigid and furious, whispering harshly to her lawyer and shooting venomous glares in my direction. I held my head high and took my seat in the witness section, Richard sitting protectively beside me. The hearing was mercifully brief. The prosecutor presented enough evidence to establish probable cause for the charges: financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, criminal neglect, and reckless endangerment. Patricia testified about her own experience with Veronica, establishing the pattern of behavior. The defense attorney tried to argue that I'd been a willing participant in my living arrangement, and that any financial contributions were gifts, not theft. Then it was my turn to speak. I took the stand and described in detail what my life had been like in that basement. I showed photographs of the conditions, medical records documenting my malnutrition and illness, bank statements proving I'd given them every cent I earned. I explained about being thrown out in the rain while seriously ill, about having no shoes or coat or phone, about standing barefoot on the sidewalk believing I might die that night. Marcus broke down crying during my testimony, his shoulders shaking with sobs. His attorney had to call for a recess. Veronica remained stone-faced, her jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles jumping. When the judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, she exploded in fury, screaming that this was a conspiracy, that I was a liar who'd manipulated everyone. The bailiffs had to restrain her while the judge threatened her with contempt charges. Marcus just sat with his head in his hands, defeated and broken. As Richard and I left the courthouse, I felt no triumph, only a deep sadness for what my family had become and a fierce determination to see this through to the end. The trial was scheduled for late April. In the months leading up to it, I received several messages from Marcus through his attorney. He wanted to apologize, wanted to explain, wanted me to understand that he'd been manipulated by Veronica. He was willing to testify against her if it would help his own case. The prosecutor told me that Marcus had taken a plea deal, agreeing to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for his testimony against Veronica. Part of me felt relief that Marcus had finally chosen to do the right thing, even if it was only to save himself. Another part of me felt disgusted that he was trying to position himself as another one of Veronica's victims when he'd actively participated in my abuse for 18 months. Richard counseled me to focus on my own healing, rather than trying to understand Marcus's motivations, Advice I tried hard to follow. I started attending a support group for elder abuse survivors that met at the community center near Richard's house. Hearing other people's stories helped me understand that I wasn't alone, that family abuse was far more common than I'd ever imagined. There were adult children who stole their parents' social security checks, spouses who isolated and controlled their elderly partners, grandchildren who moved in and took over their grandparents' homes. Each story was heartbreaking, but there was strength in our shared experiences. Through the support group, I met a woman named Helen who became a close friend. She was 78 and had been financially exploited by her daughter and son-in-law for over a decade before finally finding the courage to report them. Helen understood what I was going through in a way that even Richard, with all his compassion and experience, couldn't fully grasp. We started meeting for coffee weekly, sharing our struggles and our small victories as we rebuilt our lives. The trial lasted 5 days. The courtroom was packed with journalists, social workers, and advocates for the elderly. My case had attracted media attention because of the severity of the abuse and Veronica's pattern of targeting multiple family members. The prosecutor presented a methodical case, walking the jury through each element of the crimes with devastating clarity. Patricia testified first, describing her own experience with Veronica in painful detail. Then came my testimony, which lasted nearly a full day with cross-examination. Veronica's defense attorney tried to paint me as a willing participant who was now crying abuse to get revenge on my son. He suggested I was mentally confused, that I'd misremembered events, that the basement wasn't as bad as I claimed. But the prosecutor had evidence that couldn't be disputed. Photographs of the moldy, freezing basement with its leaking bathroom and bare mattress on the concrete floor. Medical records showing severe malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, and bronchitis that had nearly progressed to pneumonia. Bank statements proving I'd deposited my entire income into their account every month for 18 months while living in squalor. Testimony from the urgent care doctor who treated me that night, describing my condition as consistent with severe neglect and exposure. Richard testified as well, describing what he'd witnessed the night I appeared on his porch. His testimony was powerful because of his credibility as a retired judge and his obvious lack of any ulterior motive. He described my physical condition in clinical detail, the hypothermia symptoms, the terror and confusion in my eyes, the way I'd collapsed on his lawn unable to stand. Several jurors were visibly moved, and I saw 2 of them wiping their eyes. Then came Marcus's testimony. He took the stand looking like a shell of himself, broken and ashamed. He admitted to everything: the financial exploitation, the unsafe living conditions, his failure to intervene when Veronica mistreated me. He explained, voice cracking, how Veronica had gradually convinced him that I was exaggerating my complaints, that I was being dramatic, that the basement was adequate temporary housing. But he also accepted responsibility for his own actions. He acknowledged that he'd been weak and selfish, that he'd chosen the easy path of believing Veronica rather than facing the reality of what was happening to his own mother. He described the night he threw me out as the worst moment of his life, something he'd regretted the instant the door closed but had been too proud and too frightened to rectify. The defense tried to use Marcus's testimony to argue that Veronica had manipulated him too, that she was the sole architect of the abuse. But the prosecutor dismantled that argument by showing that Marcus had made active choices at every step, choices to take my money, choices to allow me to live in the basement, choices to ignore my deteriorating health, and ultimately the choice to throw me out into the freezing rain. Veronica chose not to testify in her own defense, which the prosecutor noted was her right but suggested spoke volumes about her inability to explain away the evidence. Her attorney presented character witnesses who described her as a devoted wife and mother struggling with a chronic illness. But their testimony rang hollow against the mountain of evidence showing systematic, deliberate abuse of vulnerable elderly women. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all charges, Veronica screamed and lunged at the prosecutor's table before bailiffs restrained her. The judge ordered her remanded into custody immediately pending sentencing. Marcus, who'd already pleaded guilty to reduced charges, sat with his head bowed, accepting his fate with resignation. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Veronica received 8 years in prison, the maximum allowed under state guidelines for the charges she faced. She would also be required to make full restitution to both Patricia and me, though the prosecutor warned us that actually collecting the money would likely be difficult. Marcus received 18 months in county jail with 3 years probation, a lighter sentence due to his cooperation and his own plea of being manipulated, though the judge made it clear she found his actions reprehensible regardless of influence. As I left the courthouse that final time, reporters surrounded me asking for comments. Richard helped clear a path, but I paused to make a brief statement. I wanted to speak up for all the elderly people suffering abuse in silence, believing they have nowhere to turn or that they deserve the mistreatment because they're a burden. You are not a burden. You have value and dignity and the right to be treated with respect. If someone is abusing you, even if it's family, please find the courage to reach out for help. There are people who care and systems in place to protect you. The reporters asked if I'd forgiven my son. I thought carefully before answering. Forgiveness is a process, not a moment. Marcus will have to live with what he's done, and I will have to decide over time what role, if any, he'll have in my future. But I want to be clear that his weakness doesn't excuse his actions. He made choices that nearly killed me, and those choices have consequences. Life slowly returned to a new normal after the trial ended. I continued living with Richard, who'd become family in a way that transcended blood relation. We talked about making the arrangement official through some kind of legal guardianship designation, ensuring that if anything happened to him I'd be protected, and if anything happened to me, he'd have the authority to make medical decisions. It was a practical arrangement, but it was also an acknowledgement of the deep bond we'd formed. I returned to work at the library part-time, not because I needed the money but because I enjoyed it. My coworkers welcomed me back warmly, and I found joy in helping patrons find books and organizing the stacks. The routine gave structure to my days and reminded me that I was still capable of contributing something meaningful to the world. Helen and I continued our weekly coffee dates, and I remained active in the support group. Eventually, I started volunteering to speak at events about elder abuse awareness, sharing my story to help others recognize the signs and find the courage to seek help. It was difficult at first, reliving the trauma, but it became easier as I saw how my experience could help others avoid or escape similar situations. Marcus wrote to me from jail several times. His letters were full of remorse and apologies, begging for a chance to rebuild our relationship when he was released. I read each one carefully but couldn't bring myself to respond. Richard encouraged me to take all the time I needed, reminding me that I owed Marcus nothing, not forgiveness, not a relationship, not even a response to his letters. One afternoon in late summer, nearly a year after that terrible night in the rain, I was working in the garden behind Richard's house when I heard the doorbell. Richard was at a doctor's appointment, so I went to answer it myself. Standing on the porch was Emma, my granddaughter, now 7 years old and looking small and uncertain. Behind her stood a woman I recognized as Marcus's sister Beth, my niece who lived across the country, and who I hadn't seen in several years. Beth's expression was apologetic and sad as she explained that she'd only recently learned the full truth about what had happened. She'd come to visit Marcus in jail, hoping to support her brother, but hearing his confession of what he'd done to me had shaken her deeply. Emma wanted to see you, Beth said quietly. I didn't know if you'd be willing, but I thought I should at least ask. She's been having nightmares asking where Grandma went and if you're okay. I haven't told her everything, just that there was a family problem and you had to leave. I looked down at Emma, this child I'd cared for and loved, who'd been taught by her mother to treat me with disrespect. She was holding a drawing, a picture of a house with 2 stick figures labeled Grandma and Emma in careful child handwriting. My heart ached with the complexity of it all. The love I still felt for this innocent child tangled up with the pain her parents had caused me. I knelt down to Emma's level. Hello, sweetheart. It's good to see you. Emma threw her arms around my neck, hugging me with the fierce intensity of a child who'd been frightened and confused. I missed you, Grandma. Mommy went away and Daddy's gone too, and Aunt Beth says you live here now. Can I visit you sometimes? I looked up at Beth, who nodded encouragingly. We can talk about that, I said gently. Would you like to see my garden? I'm growing tomatoes and flowers. Emma's face lit up with the first real smile I'd seen from her. As I took her hand and led her around back, Beth following behind, I realized this was the beginning of something new. Not a return to what was, but a careful, boundaried relationship that might grow into something healthy and genuine over time. Richard came home to find Emma and me picking tomatoes together while Beth sat on the patio watching. He took in the scene, caught my eye, and smiled with understanding. We all had lunch together, a simple meal that felt momentous in its normalcy. Beth apologized repeatedly for not knowing, for not checking in, for failing to see what was happening. I accepted her apologies with grace, recognizing that she too had been kept in the dark by Marcus and Veronica's deception. As Beth and Emma prepared to leave, Emma hugged me again and asked if she could come back next week. I told her we'd figure something out, that I wanted to stay in her life, but that it would take time to work out the details. Beth promised to call, to stay in touch, to help facilitate a relationship between Emma and me that wasn't dependent on or influenced by Marcus. That night, Richard and I sat on the back porch watching the sunset, sipping tea in comfortable silence. I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From that freezing basement to this peaceful home. From exploitation and abuse to dignity and justice. From despair to hope. You know what surprises me most, I said to Richard. I thought I'd feel more angry or bitter about everything that happened. But mostly I just feel grateful. Grateful that you were home that night. Grateful that I survived. Grateful for this second chance at life. Richard reached over and squeezed my hand. You survived because you're stronger than anyone gave you credit for, including yourself. You didn't just survive, Dorothy. You fought back. You refused to let them destroy you completely. That took remarkable courage. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, I thought about courage and survival, and the unexpected ways life can transform from nightmare to blessing. I thought about the family I'd lost and the family I'd found. I thought about justice served and lessons learned. And I thought about tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that, stretching out before me with possibility and promise. I was 73 years old, and for the first time in years, maybe in my entire life, I was truly free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.